Welcome. Hello, Jaden. Hopefully we'll get some more participants pretty soon. It's just the two of us thus far. All right. So we'll jump right into this if you don't mind. I'm going to do a progressive outlook.
Okay.
Is that, Jaden?
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Okay, as am I. All right, so some of the intellectual forebears of the progressive movement, it really gained steam in the 1890s, where if you wanted to look further into these individuals, Washington Gladden, Richard T. Ely, Henry Carter Adams, Edmund James, Edward Ross, J. Allen Smith, and John Bates Clark. And look what Gladden wrote. To live is not to separate ourselves from our fellows, but to unite with them in multiform ministries of giving and receiving. We are parts of a whole, right? So what they saw is they perceived certain problems with the industrial era that they wanted to rectify, the progressives, that is, right? And a couple things to note is that they one thing that's really salient to me that pops up into my head immediately is progressives were for bigger government. They were not laissez-faire. They wanted the government to intervene and to help directly resolve some of the issues that they saw as grievous problems, right? And what were some of those problems? Well, with one, right, is they took a really ethical tone. A lot of them actually were religious, were Christian leaders as well, and including Teddy Roosevelt, who contended, right, that when you look at certain books, let's see here. Let me introduce one or two books to you if you haven't come across them yet. A big one is Richard Hofstadter, His Age of Reform. And the same author has a book called American Political Tradition. And in it, he has a chapter on Teddy Roosevelt, and that's very, very interesting. Matter of fact, I would really recommend, if you ever had the time and the means to do it, on the side, American Political Tradition by Richard Hofstadter is an incredible book. But at any rate, he depicts Teddy Roosevelt as as some revisionists do. He depicts him as very eager and hungry for public attention. And so hence there is a bit of an insinuation that he tried to jump on the bandwagon when he saw that the progressive movement was hot, knowing that it would garner him attention and votes. But at the same time, you see a lot of evidence just from the mere fact of his writings with his sister, whom he called Bammy. I can't recall her exact name at the moment, but his letters to his sister Bammy, he would confide in her intimately in a way that's very sentimental and very touching. And he would tell her that he was looking for purpose in his life. He wanted his life to count, right? And he really imbibed the notion of noblesse oblige, right? The nobleman's obligation, that if you are blessed with much, then God expects much from you. And kind of like a chivalric knight, he expects you to help out those who are in need and cannot protect themselves. So he's going to take that role on as a governor of New York and a president of the United States, as a progressive president who's looking out for the little guy, right? And you notice his relative Franklin Roosevelt will do the same. And even though they're in different parties, Teddy a Republican and Franklin a Democrat. So at any rate, you look at his writings and other primary sources, and he depicts a disdain for the other wealthy kids because he was born into wealth, right? And went to Harvard, went to Grattan before that, and these other preparatory schools, he and Franklin. And so they were groomed to be the cream of the crop, coming from old wealth in New York. And he shows a bit of disdain for the other wealthy kids who just live for themselves, especially if they were very consumer oriented and materialistic. So always buying yachts, always going on trips, spending their money in ways that don't benefit humanity, that don't benefit the public at large, but just themselves, right? And he stated that it not only was immoral for them to do such, but he thought that it was unmanly also, that it was the manly thing to do, to care for those who needed it. So at any rate, to him, right, civic action, getting involved as a politician was like a moral imperative for him that he thought that God would want him to do. And so at any rate, that takes on a lot of that persona, I think, symbolizes a lot of the rhetoric of the progressives. Is the progressives, many of them were at least upper middle class in origin, or at least in status. They had attained it by the time they'd become progressives. They were pretty well to do. And a lot of their focus was upon public service, and in particular upon those who were marginalized, particularly in the eastern cities, the immigrants and their children, right, who seem to have been kind of pigeonholed into the proletariat. So at any rate, it's important to keep that in mind. So it says here, right, that a lot of them were above crass materialism, just because that was the rage of the age, so to speak, right? At this time, finally, America had become a consumer-oriented society as far as mass production, mass consumption. And remember, that entails goods that are not, would you say, elastic economic goods, right? Goods that you don't need. And so at any rate, they were concerned by that, right? For various reasons. For one, just the ethical component alone, they felt like it was making zombies of the people. In this is alive and well today, right? Hillary Clinton characterized herself as a progressive when she was running for president. And they don't want people to get lost in social media and their cell phones, etc. They want them to be civically minded. They want them to read the news, to be up to date as to what their government is up to, and to hold the government accountable, and have a sense of civic concern, right? And so the term that some of them used, like Gladden, was association, and versus class consciousness. They were concerned also about class warfare and class friction and class disintegration. Disintegration is probably not the right word, but atomization, where everyone just, all the different classes and demographics just go into their own little circles everywhere, right? And there's no sense of Americana anymore. There's no sense of a united popular culture, and popular normative behavior and popular value system that's commonly embraced. But everyone's just looking out for him or herself. And to them, that was a nightmare. That was something to be concerned about. And so they wanted cooperation amongst the different classes and have them stop alienating themselves. And of course, they did not want them to fight. And so you look at Jane Addams, for instance, who was famous for her whole house settlement house in Chicago. And she was scared to death by the Pullman strike. She was literally afraid that her family members were going to be terrorized by a mass insurrection of the poor workers. And so, right, that from the beginning, there's kind of a mixture of altruistic and selfish concerns that the progressives had. Altruistic, that we're going to get into, the extent to which they tried to protect consumers. They tried to give hope to the marginalized. They tried to hold the big businesses and the trust accountable and to regulate them and to break the trusts up. But they also were concerned about being literally caught in a class war. And so they were trying to, there might have been a little bit of a ulterior motive in trying to give hope to the poor so that they'd be less inclined to rebel, and there'd be less inclination for there to be a Bolshevik-like revolution. So they use that term association versus mutualism. And mutualism, as I have here defined, protection of common class interests. They wanted people to look beyond their own class. And so let's see here, more government intervention. So they wanted to curb excessive upper class individualism. So look at here, 1905, the wealthiest 1% controlled 88% of the nation's assets, over 1/3 of the capital of the country, and a quarter of the factory laborers, just the top 1%. And so that was concerning for them. That was disconcerting. They wanted to do something to, and that's the thing, is you saw the conservative argument against this is some of them made no bones about it, that they were at least quasi-socialist, some of the progressive leaders, right? They wanted a sense of commonality. They wanted to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. You see that in the form of their taxation policies. They wanted graduated income taxes, for instance. They wanted to not only, 5% is a lot more of $1 million than is 5% taken from, 3,000 as an annual income. But also they wanted a higher percentage for the wealthier brackets. So almost punitive, right? Almost punishing the rich. They wanted to tax the heck out of them because they wanted to ameliorate class friction and help out the poor. And so at any rate, you have consolidations from 1897 to 1904. 1/3 of companies were, quote, merged, right? That's disconcerting to the progressives. So what did they want to do? They wanted to break up trusts. William H. Taft, actually, his administration broke up the most trusts of any administration. After it had been set up, the system somewhat had been set up by Teddy Roosevelt's administration. They established the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice was to sue trusts and take them to courts and let the courts decide, right? And so I'm going to get back to that in a little bit. Let's see here. The Wilson administration, they had the Clayton Act, and the Clayton Act to this day is followed. It gave specific examples of violating the antitrust law, because the antitrust law was very vague, right? And to some people who allege that there was a plutocracy, they contend that it was vague. It was vague on purpose, right? So that it wouldn't be enforced very strictly, to look out for the wealthy and those who were forming such trusts. They wanted union recognition and collective bargaining, where the unions are formally recognized and they're able to go to the bargaining table and to ask for what was very popular at that time, an 8-hour workday, increased salaries, right? And Teddy Roosevelt, he was famous for his square deal with the United Mine Workers Association. They insisted upon, they tried to insist upon bargaining at the table for an increase in wages and an 8-hour workday and a few other things, and collective bargaining rights. And the gentleman named George Baer, B-A-E-R, really, he played the public bad guy, the public villain. He has a very arrogant quote where he says basically that the good Lord put it into the hands of the bosses to decide the salaries, to decide the working conditions of their workers. And it's up to our judicious, volition to decide what we do and what we don't want to offer our workers. And that's hence the way it's meant to be, in kind of a social Darwinist type, right, mood. And so that didn't go well with the public. And so Teddy Roosevelt jumped in and threatened to take over the anthracite or hard coal of his factories. And he threatened to divvy it out to the poor for free, to take it from the boss. And that hadn't happened before with the president, right? And unless they went to the collective bargaining table and made some concessions to their workers. And the workers didn't get everything they wanted, but they got some. And so Teddy Roosevelt continued in very kind of paternalistic fashion, as if he were the father figure over both parties, saying that, okay, you both got a square deal. I forced the bosses to come to terms, but I also, they didn't give everything that was asked by the workers. And there's another instance of Teddy Roosevelt when they went after the Standard Oil Trust, right, of Rockefellers, and they broke it up. They forced it to be broken up. J.P. Morgan approached Teddy Roosevelt supposedly and said, "Is this what I'm to expect with my trust? Is your administration going to go after mine as well?" And Teddy Roosevelt contended, "Relax. We needed this for catharsis, right? The public needed to see Rockefeller punished because there's that sense of envy, right? And that's where you have a value difference with the progressives. Is to the progressives, right? They don't like the fact that you have, these Tom Brady's winning Super Bowls all the time, right? These Rockefellers and Carnegies that are dominating their industries. Something seems inherently unfair and inherently of poor health, unhealthy about that. And so to them, right, they want everyone to get a participation medal, so to speak, right? Maybe this is not a good analogy, but they want everyone who plays to get a trophy, right? And that, I just find it interesting because you still find this ideological divide, right, today in discourse today in politics, with the Democratic Party oftentimes embracing a very kind of progressive platform and contending that they want things to be more fair for the poor. They want it to be more fair for the manual laborers. But conservatives contending that is going against the spirit of meritocracy, right? Of earning what you get. And that you shouldn't punish those who are successful in a capitalist economy, who have arguably, I want to use that term as a qualifier, fair and square won, right? So at any rate, they want to sublimate working class animosity. They don't want a class war, right? So Chicago in the that's supposed to be 1880s, not 1870s. Chicago area in the 1880s was really bad with the strikers against Cyrus McCormick's plants and the Haymarket Square riot in 1887. And things got really confrontational and bloody. And then the Pullman strike in 1894. And so this scared the heck out of the progressives. And they also were concerned about consumerism and amusements, that the poor people were spending their discretionary income, right? What they had left after paying their bills, that they were spending it needlessly on Nickelodeons to watch movies, the amusement parks, etc., right? And you find that today, right? A lot of times you could find a class orientation around bars to drink alcohol and so forth. A lot of times that stereotype has arisen for a reason, that you have people they're working with their hands, 8 to 12 hours a day and just working their bottoms off. And they just want some type of escape at the end of the day because they know they have to go back to that cruel monotony the very next morning. And so at any rate, they were concerned about cycles of poverty that people could and would not extricate themselves from. And that as long as they would be down there, that the form of escapism might settle the burning anger at that moment, but it was no long-term solution, right? They were going to stay angry about being in the class that they were in. So they wanted to do something about that. So they were for consumer protection laws. Paint that has lead in it and on baby toys, right? And little baby chews on it and gets lead poisoning, something of that sort. Also housing, right? Very famous Jacob Riis, right? You see in #1 section, the dilapidated, very unhealthy, very dangerous housing conditions that the poor were living in. They wanted standards that need to be met. And that's why to this day, right, you can't even add a room onto your house legally without going to the local city council and getting approval and them having to look for fire hazard issues and other safety issues, right? So the progressives were behind that as well for consumer protection. And then, of course, right, with the consumer protection laws, I think of the Federal Meat Inspection Act, right? And the Food and Drug Administration and the FDA. And so that's an expression to this day, right? When someone says, I don't think you want to know how the sausage is made, because, you know, and you had that famous book by Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, right? And you have rats going into the factory and falling into the vats and getting grinded into the bologna meat and all that gross stuff. So they wanted a way to rectify that and protect consumers from what they were buying. Because after all, right, to stop the process of production and to put in safety regulations cost money, at least in the short run. And so the idea was is these problems with consumer products could have easily been rectified, but they were not by the free volition of the manufacturers, simply out of greed, because they wanted to keep the production process going as efficiently and cheaply as possible. So they wanted something done about that. And then urban malaise, right? Just the sense of just moral, not having a moral compass, not having a sense of whatever sense you felt of right and wrong, your worldview of answering what you believe to be the problems and the solutions to life, especially as an immigrant, going topsy-turvy when you get into a big anonymous city, so that your old value systems don't seem to fit in with your new realities. And you have this sense of just of being a lost soul, right? Living in the cities as a manual laborer, especially. So they developed settlement houses, right? And the settlement houses were something else. They provided a myriad of services to people for free. So babysitting children, giving night classes and vocational classes to adults, cleaning, bathing, and feeding the kids, just getting them off the streets. The progressives were behind recreational sports, because the idea was, right, is that when kids have no hope and they're bound to just get into trouble. And so notice this quote right here. I see that the individual criminal is not always wholly to blame, that many crimes grow directly out of the sins and injustices of his or her society. So progressives, right, were lenient against immigrants, the poor, children for crimes, because they felt like if they were in a really, for lack of a better adjective, really pitiful circumstances, that what do you expect them to do? They're going to get into trouble. They're going to do something, immoral. They're going to deviate from society's norms and be up to no good. So they wanted to be lenient upon them. So they fashioned the modern system of the juvenile hall system to give mitigated or less severe penalties for certain crimes against juveniles. And like I said, those who were living in urban ethnic enclaves as well, in Chicago, in New York City, etc. All right. So that quote there was from Fighting Bob La Follette. He was a senator, governor of Wisconsin, prided himself on being a leader amongst the progressives. They also wanted to restrain moral decadence. What they were worried about in particular, right, is they were worried about the disintegration of the family unit, the nuclear family of parents and children. And they had reason to be a little bit alarmed. For one, right, the divorce rate went up by four times as high in the 1880s and 1890s. Alcoholic consumption doubled. And so they were for crusades. So they were for crusades against alcohol, crusades against prostitution. Like I said, a lot of the progressives were middle class, older middle class, the established classes like the intelligentsia, those who had a college education and had a white collar job where they didn't have to work with their hands. And so they prided themselves from the Victorian era before this that middle class norms were superior to the norms of other classes, right? And mainly the Victorian norms are pretty much Judeo-Christian, being faithful to your spouse, against any kind of sexual immorality, being self-controlled with alcohol, etc., right? So they went on these big crusades against alcohol and prostitution in particular. And so, and it's interesting because when you get into the economic realm and the political realm, my goodness, we see plenty of fire and ire and animosity. But boy, it arguably goes to even a higher level when you get into social realm, right? And telling Americans how to live their private lives. And so needless to say, the progressives were very confrontational and very controversial. Okay. So do you have any questions, Jaden, so far?
So on number 17, we were looking at progressivism utilize new sciences like sociology to study the combat systematic cycles of poverty and marginalization. So that's like, is that like I think that's true, but could you I'm just a little confused on that one.
Oh, sorry. That's not it. I'm looking for the test questions. I have them open. I had them open. And let's see here. Here it is. Sorry. So
that would be
no problem. The progressives, right? They almost had a sense of almost, to me, it reminds me of deism of when we did the War for Independence, is that the idea that the universe operates by natural laws, right? And that God is like a clockmaker, and he made everything to abide by rational laws, including human interaction. And so anthropology, right? The scientific study of cultural evolution of different peoples, sociology, the most, I would argue, subjectively, sociology, right? The interaction of the individual with his or her society and the laws thereof. They were huge on sociology and psychology and mass psychology, etc., right? They believe that everything ought to function rationally, logically, scientifically. And so they put a big emphasis on sociology in particular, on political science, on psychology, right? And trying to find out what makes people tick in such a way that brings about societal harmony, right? And well-being. And so they were huge on those social sciences. And so you have, Woodrow Wilson as an example of that, our first president, who was a Princeton professor and with a PhD. You have Fighting Bob La Follette and these others, right, who hired other intellectuals. They hired professors in those fields to work as their brain trusts, right? Because to them, if they could get behind the laws of whatever subject they were endeavoring into, they could bring about the healthiest circumstances, right? And so again, sociology, like with crime and so forth, they thought, okay, people are largely a byproduct of their environment. So we must change their environment to help change their behavior. And so hence like the settlement houses, right? Trying to get the kids off the street and get them into a very healthy, very ambitious, work-oriented, driven environment. And so absolutely, they were really, really big on those things. And I'm sorry, I did the progressive movement. And let me see here. It should be here. Yeah, I have it here on the bottom. So let me go to the questions themselves. I'm sorry, Jaden. Let's see here. Hold on. So you say number 17? Yes, progressivism utilized new social sciences like sociology to study and combat systemic cycles of poverty and marginalization. That is absolutely meant to be true. Yeah.
And now
that may have been one that I'm glad you asked that, Jaden, because it may have been one that fell through the cracks. I have a few every now and then that aren't found in the argumentative assignment. And that's one more reason why I do Zoom lectures, to try to supplement and fill in the gaps.
Okay. And then also, did Roosevelt support like socialized medicines, transportation, and education?
Roosevelt did not go that far. No, what number was that?
Okay.
I'm sorry?
That was number 19.
Number 19. Which of the following is false regarding popular depictions of Theodore Roosevelt as a self-proclaimed progressive president? So A, Richard Hofstadter claims that Roosevelt embraced the progressive movement as a manly chivalric knight's errand. Absolutely. B, Roosevelt took a self-proclaimed impartial father figure role amidst labor strife. Absolutely. C, Roosevelt's administration publicly attacked bad or misbehaving trusts, some believing to give cathartic satisfaction to the public. Absolutely. And D, Roosevelt supported socialized medicine, transportation, and education. No. No, he didn't go that far. Like I said, a lot of people contend that on the scale of progressives, that Roosevelt was relatively conservative. So yeah, anything that, you know, because with socialized medicine, socialized transportation, right? To me, right, that would be like a guy named Hazen Pingree, Pingree, the mayor of Detroit, Michigan. Those guilty of white collar crimes had their property confiscated and given to the homeless. I mean, this guy did some radical things. Let's see here, subsidized transportation and medicine and so forth. I believe La Follette went that far as well. So some went that far, but that I call that to myself gas and water socialism, right? Where you don't want to completely do away with the capitalist economy. You want to let it to allow it to continue, but you want to make certain exceptions, right? Where you say, okay, if everyone can't afford a nice suit and a nice dress, a nice automobile, right, going into the first decade of the 1900s, then so be it. That's the capitalist system we live in, right? We're not for forcing equality. If you can't afford a yacht, then it stinks for you, but sorry, we're not going to do anything about it politically. But access to medicine and medical attention, right? Access to public transportation, access to electricity and water. Some people were contending, right, that those ought to be separated as services and covered under natural rights, under our founding fathers' notions of natural rights, what every human being, regardless of money, is entitled to or ought to be entitled to, right? And so with gas and water socialism, I call it like diet socialism, right? Is they just pick a few exceptions and they want it to be socialistic with those services so that it's not based upon how much you pay, but everyone is entitled to it regardless, right? So the spirit of Obamacare, et cetera, right? That is reminiscent to me of gas and water socialism. So some progressives were for that. Especially, it seems like the most radical progressives were those at the local and state levels. Look up a guy named Hiram Johnson here in California. And like I said, Hazen Pingree in Michigan. And you get some pretty socialistic, pretty, far to the left ideas and platforms, but not Teddy Roosevelt. And really not any of our presidents at that high of a level. All right.
Okay. Thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
last week we were on number 11, and we didn't find anything in the argumentative assignments really about that, like
Sure.
addressing
Oh
it
yeah, I've been holding on to that one.
on
Yeah, if you don't mind, Jaden, if I could do that when we cover test 2, because and I'd also like to have more people here that could benefit from that one, because you're absolutely right. Your number 11 is not in there. If you don't mind, I'd like to save that for the test when we do the test.
Okay,
I mean, just to reward you here
sure.
for being here today, that is actually false. It's intended to be false. I'm going to depict the imperialism in the Hawaiian Islands in a revisionist fashion and very kind of cynical, negative, critical fashion, because there's just so much data that leans that way, where
Okay.
it kind of smacks of a plutocracy of the wealthy throwing their weight around and having their way for their own self-interest.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So notice number 15, that is part of Hofstadter's famous thesis, his status revolution thesis. Is to Hofstadter, he says, right? Okay, yeah, the progressives seem to be altruistic in their settlement house projects, their consumer protection laws, their breaking up of the trusts, their support for labor unions. They seem to be for like the downtrodden, right? But he says, but look, they had something to gain from this movement. They resented the power of big business. They were eclipsed by big business, not only economically, but socially, because they had been, as you know, intellectuals and as small scale lawyers and writers and professors, etc. They had once had a lot of prestige given to them, but now the Carnegies and the Rockefellers eclipse them with prestige and fame, as well as with money. And so he contends that they were experiencing a social revolution, a status revolution that they were losing in. And so hence he's contending, right, that there's a degree of sour grapes amongst the progressives of envy, right, of jealousy and envy with big business. And so hence they had a personal reason to have a sense of animosity and opposition to the corporations. And so as you see there on number 12, progressives were depicted as old middle class reformers. No, not that one. I apologize. Number 15, revisionist history of the progressives contends that they were anxiety-ridden spokesmen for the old middle class who sensed their own obsolescence, that they were becoming obsolete in this new age of industrialization and the machine, resented big business, and feared being caught in a class war. That is true. All right, so that's the revisionist interpretation to the progressives, as opposed to number 12. Progressives were depicted as old middle class reformers wanting to eradicate or mitigate what they perceived to be injustices and problems of the industrial era, as if they had just purely civic virtue behind their motives, right? And that is also true. They're depicted as such in court history. All right. So any other questions on any of the other numbers, Jaden? Think about it, okay? And I can.
Yeah, I was thinking number 8.
Number 8.
Yeah. From last week.
That's all right. So President William Howard Taft's famous diplomacy with Latin America involved a penchant for military brinkmanship and intervention. No. The expression was dollar diplomacy. And another expression used is informal empire as opposed to formal empire. What he saw in Africa, right, beneath the Sahara Desert, what he saw in North Africa by the French was formal colonization, just bringing in a military and formally taking over other countries. He said, we don't need to do that. That's too costly in resources and men and in conflict. He says, all we need to do is flood in a majority of our products and make these small Latin American and Pacific Island countries dependent upon our goods and services, and we have them where we want them. And there's no need. And with brinkmanship, we're going to get into that with the Cold War, but that is to throw your military weight around diplomatically to the point of threatening war to get what your diplomatic demands entail, right? And so I think of it, you know, at the micro level, like on an elementary playground or high school, right? Where a guy says, hey, I like that, what you have, I want it, give it to me or else, and threatens to beat you up. If you don't give me what I want, it's basically extortion, right? I'll threaten annihilation militarily, forcefully. And that's what I meant by military brinkmanship. And so brinkmanship will become a term in the Cold War, whereby when we try to do that in light of our our geopolitical competition and military competition with the Soviet Union. But yeah, not yet and not Taft in Latin America. So that one's intended to be false.
Okay, and so number 3. So on number 3, what do you mean by primal roots?
Oh, Nietzsche. Primal roots of basically militarism. The primal roots, right? Because he was really big on Darwinism. And so your primal roots are just basically brute force, aggression, militarism, what was the expression he used? The will to power, right? The will to power, the need to, the instinct, the animal instinct, he called it, to impose your will on weaker people. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Yeah, don't get me started with Nietzsche. I think that guy's writings are some of the scariest of modern history and intellectual history. So let's see here. So on your handout, okay? Let's see here. So we have the introduction. So number 1 is good old-fashioned court history, right? Progressive do-gooders. And you're going to see evidence of them going out of their way to protect the weaker segments of society, like Teddy Roosevelt contended he was doing, right, with his sister and his letters to his sister. The desire to help out the less fortunate, the marginalized. So Jane Addams is big as supporting data in that section. Jacob Riis. Jane Addams had a dad, right, who was a pastor, and she wanted to follow his footsteps and make him proud. She wanted to help out the marginalized and give them hope in settling and forming her settlement house, arguably the most famous one. There was a woman named Lillian Wald, W-A-L-D, of the same almost equal fame in New York. She was a nurse and a progressive leader and really did a lot for the poor in New York City. Legal assistance, garbage disposal, access to water and utilities, education, babysitting. And then Jacob Riis, right? Danish immigrant who ostensibly tried to pay it forward when a group of progressives helped him get on his feet and really, worked effectively as a muckraker. And this is another instance of showing that Teddy Roosevelt was a bit conservative amongst progressives. Is he used that term quite often, that they were troublemakers, that were people going in and finding the manure, metaphorically, and throwing it out for everyone to see. And that was their desire, right? In muckraking, is they wanted to expose, injustices and horrific practices, so that people would grow a sense of indignation, of righteous anger, and they would make a demand for something, for that problem, that issue, that practice to be changed, right? And for some people to be held accountable. So muckrakers, Lincoln Steffens, right, with the railroads and political corruption. Ida B. Tarbell, the robber barons and her exposés on Rockefeller, etc. And that was a very famous picture from Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives. These children right here sleeping out on the street. But notice also there was a sense of cultural conflict amongst children of immigrants, because the immigrants were all about communalism, and you exist only for the good of your family. You're just one part of your family that you were to look after. And the progressives were trying to get adolescent immigrants' children to come into these settlement houses and to get educated, to learn English, and to go to school and try to make something of themselves. And to the immigrants, that was selfish, to try to have their kids, taken away. And not only that, they tried to groom them like kind of WASP middle class that the progressives were, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant middle class people. So some people contended that the progressives were trying to make mini-me's of these immigrant children. So let's see here. And then revisionist historiography focuses on ulterior motives. So most famously, right, I got that from McGarre's book, but most famously is the status revolution thesis by Hofstadter, that they were experiencing, a sense of envy and jealousy of big business. And also that they were concerned that they were going to get literally caught in the middle of a class war, being middle class themselves, right? So that they had an ulterior motive to help out the poor. Then number 3 contends, right, that the founding fathers wanted everything to be by merit, by what you earn and work for. And progressives, right, were for taxing the heck out of the wealthy, and almost on a punitive scale, and giving a handout to the poor through safety net legislation, like unemployment insurance, right? Unemployment checks, the dole, the welfare at the state and local level checks. And that runs away from what America stands for with meritocracy. So that's the conservative argument against the progressives. And then this is the progressive rebuttal, right? Arguing that some people are trapped in cycles of poverty and they need extra help. And that's it, Jaden. If you have any other questions, I'll be happy to address them.
Thank you. I really like this assignment.
Good. I do too, Jaden. I think this is a fascinating subject.
Yeah, it's a really nice one.
All right. So
see you at the movie.
All right. So you take care, okay? And I'll see you soon.
Take care. See you soon.
All right. Take care, Jaden. Bye-bye.
Bye.